What's up, guys? Welcome back to another Minipod here on the Lighting the Lamp podcast channel. And today I will be discussing a couple of NHL news things that I think are important to talk about, but I've already kind of waited to marinate on them a little bit, and I just don't think that we're going to be ending up getting them into the next episode of the podcast. So I want to do it here on another Minipod and just kind of, you know, not rap at you guys, but, see what you guys think. So the first topic I want to talk about today is the changes to the draft. Actually, the NHL announced some changes to the draft. A reminder of the draft lottery changes approved by the Board of Governors, as tweeted out by Pierre LeBrun. The number of lottery draws reduced from 3 to 2 starting in 2021, so the last place team can't draw any lower than number 3 overall. I think this is a pretty important rule to change. I think it's absolutely ridiculous last year that the Detroit Red Wings got shafted as hard as they did. When a team is that bad, I mean historically bad, as it looks like the Buffalo Sabres are going to be historically bad, and they have been already this season, you don't want to encourage tanking, but when a team has a bad season, they need a little bit of something, especially a team like the Detroit Red Wings or the Buffalo Sabres, who are clearly in the middle of a rebuild, and there's absolutely no reason why a team like the New York Rangers, who were one of the hottest teams down the stretches last year, were pushing for a playoff spot, should have gotten that number 1 overall pick. I thought that was absolutely ridiculous, and I think that this is a good change. So the last place team can't draw any lower than 3, which I think is a solid positive change that needed to happen. So that starts this year. Starting next year, the maximum move up for lottery winner is limited to 10 spots. So only 11 teams can win the lottery and draft first overall instead of the 16 teams, which I think, again, is another necessary change. I think it's ridiculous that a team could potentially lose out, by the playoffs, miss the playoffs by only, a point or two, and then draft first overall. Because if the league wants parity and the league wants teams to be able to rebuild and go through the rebuild process properly, I think that it needs to be a little bit more fair to those teams at the bottom. Again, you don't want to encourage tanking, but that's why we have the number 3 rule here. No team can win the draft lottery more than twice in a 5-year period starting next year, which I think is fine. I don't know how they're going to handle it. I don't know if it's going to be, say, for example, the Sabres are up for the first overall pick 3 years in a row, that maybe they just don't put their name in the lottery and they draft second, or if the Buffalo Sabres ball does get picked, or the card, however they end up doing it, either the ping pong balls or the cards that they used to flip. If the Sabres get called for that pick, maybe then whatever team gets picked second becomes first, and the Buffalo Sabres just go to second. I don't know how they're going to handle that. But that being said, I do think this is a very necessary change as well, because you do want the teams at the bottom to get a fair shake. You do want them to have the opportunity to rebuild and be able to play competitive hockey again sooner rather than later. But at the same time, you don't want to encourage a team to just tank it out like the Edmonton Oilers did, despite the fact that they got all these first overall picks, and yet the team is still not great. That has more to say about management than the draft process. However, that being said, this rule, I think, is a good implementation because it does not encourage tanking. In fact, it actively discourages tanking. You can't get the pick more than twice in a 5-year period. And I think that this is a good way to balance out the draft. I think that the quote-unquote top team, aka the bottom team, the worst team in the league, not being able to draft lower than 3rd is important, because, you don't want to be rewarding teams who miss the playoffs by 1 point with a first overall pick and a generational talent. I mean, imagine if a team had missed the playoffs by 1 or 2 points, and then they get to draft Connor McDavid. I think that's a bit much. And I know that the lottery was initially implemented, again, to prevent tanking, but I think it's a bit ridiculous, personally. There's no reason why the Islanders or the Rangers or any other team should be competing for a playoff spot up until the last game and then get the first overall pick. That being said, this last rule also prevents a team from saying, oh, well, we can't draft any lower than 3rd, so we're just going to keep getting that first overall pick. Well, you're not, because you can only do it twice in a 5-year period. So some interesting changes to the draft. I think it's necessary. I think it's about time. I think they're smart. I think this makes it more balanced for everybody involved. The bottom teams, the top teams. I think everybody benefits from these changes. And I think in general it's going to help the league turn more into, as even as the league already is with the amount of parity in the league, I think this is only going to encourage it more. So I just wanted to talk very briefly about those draft lottery changes that are coming to the NHL. Again, the draft lottery draws reduced from 3 to 2 starts this year. And the other two rules, the maximum move-up rule and the no team can win a draft lottery more than twice rule, starts next year. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the Tim Peel incident. And the reason that I didn't jump and rush to do this was because I wanted to marinate on it a little bit. I wanted to formulate an opinion, and I wanted to really have an idea of how I truly felt, because there's always that initial gut, this should never happen. And then there's the follow-up to that, which is, that happens all the time. And then, after a little bit of time, you kind of settle somewhere in the middle. So my thoughts on the Tim Peel incident. So for those of you that don't know, Tim Peel was caught on a hot mic talking to, I believe it was the Nashville Predators bench, although I'm not positive, saying, I know it's not much, but I wanted to get an effing penalty on Nashville, and then it cuts out. The league immediately launched an investigation into what Peel was talking about, why he was saying such a thing, and he's since been terminated. Now, Tim Peel was going to retire at the end of this year anyway. His last game was going to be in April. So you could argue that his termination was a bit ridiculous for a man who's going to retire in about a month or so anyway. You could also say that the NHL, to a certain extent, is culpable in what Tim Peel was saying, because they've encouraged the policing the game and making the game balanced and aspect. And I've gone back and forth. Obviously, your gut feeling and your gut reaction to this is, no, Tim Peel needs to ref the rulebook. Every ref needs to ref the rulebook. And that's a fine argument. I think there's no issue with that. However, you can't say every ref needs to strictly ref the rulebook and then turn around and say the refs need to let the boys play when it comes time to playoffs. You can't have it both ways. And policing the game has always been a part of the NHL. There's always been makeup calls. There's always been ticky-tacky calls because maybe the ref didn't exactly catch a penalty in the first place, and then so he calls something else to make up. So, a perfect example is a high stick. Say there's a high stick or a blatant trip in the neutral zone that every ref sees, every ref knows is a penalty, but for some reason they don't call it. You ever see that happen? And then about a minute and a half later, you notice, oh, hey, they called a slash on that same, on the team. Say Team A trips somebody in the neutral zone. Nobody calls it. 2 minutes later, Team A gets a slashing penalty, and you see the replay, and you're thinking, that's not really a penalty. But you know why they called it. They called it because they screwed up. Or another thing that happens all the time. Team A gets a 2-minute power play for a trip. They show the replay and the refs look at it and go, ooh, that really wasn't a trip. That was a bad call. What happens after that? 5-10 minutes later, Team B gets a power play on a ticky-tack call. Where you look and you're like, well, technically, yeah, it is a slash, but they don't really call it all often, so why are they calling it this time? It's a makeup penalty. The refs realize, ooh, Team A shouldn't have got that power play. We got to give one to Team B now. It happens all the time. When you watch hockey, it happens on an almost game basis. The refs police the game, and they play the game, essentially. You can argue the refs should ref strictly the rulebook and only the rulebook. But then you can't say that and then tell me, oh, it's playoffs. You got to let the boys play in the playoffs. Well, technically, if we went by what you just said, the refs should ref the rulebook all the time. Now, that being said, Tim Peel, shouldn't have said what he said because you don't admit it, first of all. I mean, he didn't know he was on a hot mic, but you don't admit it straight up to the other referee like, yeah, I was looking for a penalty on Nashville, right? Because it looks bad. Because then it brings into question, well, why is he looking for a penalty on Nashville? Is he trying to rig the game? Is that an XYZ? Blah, 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 blah. You know. You also need to understand that the refs shouldn't be actively looking to get a penalty on a certain team. If the ref makes a bad call or if they miss a penalty, you have to just accept that as the human part of the game. As a referee, if you make a bad call, you just got to own it. But I don't think that you should then go out and think, well, now I owe this other team a power play. That's my issue. I have no problems with the refs policing the game. You know, if Tom Wilson's out there throwing elbows every other hit and they start to call it on him and then they start to call the ticky-tack stuff on Tom Wilson to settle him down, I have no issue with that. Because you need to police the game in a way that's going to keep it safe for everybody. You can't just let him go around throwing elbows into people's heads. I don't have a problem with that. Same thing. I don't have a problem if the refs look at each other and say, all right, you know, this is a big playoff implications. We're going to let the boys play tonight. I don't have an issue with that. In fact, I think that's what makes playoff hockey so great. What I do have an issue with is the refs missing a call and then saying, oh, we got to call the next thing no matter how small it is. Or the refs making a bad call and then saying, well, now we owe Team B a power play. It's the human part of the game. They're going to make mistakes. Believe me, I'm an Islanders fan. The Islanders got basically no power plays at all for the majority of last season. For some reason, I don't know why. And even a little bit of this season, the refs just refuse to call penalties against the teams the Islanders are playing. Specifically against Matt Barzal. They've definitely swallowed their whistles when it comes to him. That being said, it's the human element of the game. They make mistakes. They're allowed to make mistakes. They're people. It happens. What I don't think should happen is then they make a mistake, so then they essentially commit an intentional mistake to make up for the previous mistake, which is what Tim Peel was doing. So I think the move by the NHL is a PR move for sure. Again, Tim Peel's been a lifelong referee. He was going to retire next month anyway. I think the NHL made a PR move in order to save face. Do I think Tim Peel was at fault? He was probably just doing what he's done his whole career. But do I think that he plays plays a part in his own dismissal? Absolutely. Look, he didn't know he was on a hot mic, but A, you shouldn't be talking openly about it. It should be an unspoken thing, if anything. And B, I have no issue with the refs policing the game, but I do have an issue with them intentionally looking for a penalty on one team. Because like I said, if you make a mistake, you make a mistake. Own it. It happens. It is what it is. So I don't think Tim Peel's like disgraced. I don't think his legacy is tarnished. I think Tim Peel was just doing what every other referee does. And we've definitely seen the impact of this already. The other night we saw Wayne Simmons went up to a referee and he was clutching the live mic, muffling it. We saw the other night against the Islanders, we saw basically a couple of penalties that were let go, essentially, which Wes McCauley always likes to let the boys play, and I respect that about him, but there were some that you were just like, okay, come on. This is a bit ridiculous now. And we've seen some of the other games where the referees are letting things go. So we've already seen the impact of this. I think, honestly, give this about a month or two, it's just going to blow over, and the refs will be back to the way they are. So don't think all of a sudden, oh, the games are rigged. You know, it's not. The games are not rigged. If you think the games are rigged, you're stupid. It's just the way that the referees have always policed the game. And I think you need to tweak it a little bit if you're a referee. I don't think you should be intentionally looking for calls. But if you want to ref the game that you're being given, you know, you always ref the game you're given, you know. You're not going to ref a rivalry game of the Rangers against the Islanders the same way you're going to ref a game of the Rangers playing the Phoenix Coyotes or the Arizona Coyotes. You just don't. It just doesn't happen. So just wanted to give my thoughts on those two. Short little mini pod here. Stay tuned for some other news and updates, as I'm sure I will have multiple news and updates for you guys. I do want to start another series soon, actually. where I take deep dives into the videotape of certain teams. And I think the first team I want to take a deep dive into their tape of is the Philadelphia Flyers, to explain to you why the Flyers goalies are not at fault for their recent struggles and why the defense is horrendously bad, and you need to lay off the goalies if you're a Flyers fan. And just why are the Flyers getting rocked so hard this year? I want to do a deep dive into that. So stay tuned for that. I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys again next time.